I became interested in ignorance during my PhD studies at the London School of Economics in the United Kingdom. And this was when I had moved to London in my mid-20s. And I, therefore, in about 2005 or 2006, was in the early stages of my research, about 1 year into my PhD. Two different things particularly coalesced in order to really spark my interest in ignorance. And one was the empirical material that I was looking at. And the other facet were some of the readings that I was doing around genealogies of knowledge, drawing on people like Foucault, and in particular, his readings of Nietzsche. And empirically, my project looked at the effort to determine whether certain antidepressant drugs, the technical acronym was SSRI, so selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor drugs. These are drugs that are very well-known medications like Prozac, for example. Prozac is an antidepressant drug that would be categorized as an SSRI. And I was definitely not negative about the usage of these drugs, but I was aware of a lot of debate over whether they did have some negative side effects that weren't being addressed or recognized publicly by different regulatory groups. And some of those side effects had to do with the question of whether, in very rare instances, the drugs could lead to either enhanced suicidal ideation, which means thinking about suicide, planning it, and then the actual act of suicide, carrying it out, as well as linked in some rare cases to homicidal behavior, as well as questions surrounding the possible negative side effects of the drugs when it came to fetal development. So whether mothers while pregnant should be taking the drugs or not. So there was lots of debates about how much we really knew about the risks and how much regulators were able to place pressure on pharmaceutical manufacturers to being forthcoming with some of the clinical trials that showed more adverse negative reactions than they were discussing publicly. So I began to realize that a whole constellation of factors surrounding secrecy, denial, obfuscation, efforts to dodge regulatory questions were clearly at the heart of my empirical research that I was discovering through interviews with different practitioners. So that was the empirical picture that was arising from my research that led me to really take an interest in the production of different medicines and the commercial role of different pharmaceutical manufacturers, and how that commercial imperative to make a lot of money from medications can often contrast and work against the effort to admit it when there is internal knowledge within a company about some effects that might make your product look worse in the public eye than you wish it to appear. Theoretically, I was really enjoying the effort to engage deeply in social theory, and I was reading widely across a number of different political thinkers. And this was rooted in a longstanding interest in the question of how different epistemes are formed and subscribed to by different groups in different historical and geographical regions. So I was very interested in the work of Michel Foucault, but I also found some of his work and approach to be quite limited, particularly when it came to questions of what happens when knowledge is not rooted in the production of power, but actually people don't want to know something that is not in their interest in acknowledging. So Foucault, I thought, placed too much of a positive emphasis on the capacity of knowledge to reach particular political goals or objectives. He wasn't as attuned, in my view, to the ways that power holders deliberately tried to shield themselves from knowledge that they did not want to acknowledge. And at that time, I was also reading Nietzsche, and particularly Beyond Good and Evil, quite closely. And I felt that some of his comments about the non-recognition of the legacy of Christianity in the thought of Enlightenment thinkers and afterwards was quite interesting for looking at how disciplines form knowledge and what they ignore. So that led me to really take an interest in the social study of ignorance and to realize that the field was not as extensively developed as I assumed as a PhD student it should be. I was surprised there wasn't more written on the particular topic, although I started to notice that pockets of focus were emerging from people like Robert Proctor and others. Yeah, that's an excellent point. So for me, Proctor was not necessarily the biggest influence on my research at all, partly because I had already been developing some work on what I was calling the will to ignorance that preceded my even reading of Proctor. And it's quite interesting who actually alerted me to Proctor's work. It was actually Paul Gilroy, who's a very influential Black British theorist of racial injustice and political theory more broadly in the United Kingdom and globally. And he was one of my two internal board chairs when it came to looking at my PhD progression at the LSE. And it was actually Paul who really highlighted what he saw as the originality or the value of my work on ignorance in my thesis, because my supervisor, Nicholas Rose, was also very positive. But I think Nicholas was also thinking, we were trying to determine how much my own ideas about ignorance differed from the focus on episteme and knowledge production in the work of Foucault. We were genuinely both a little bit perplexed by the question of how new is this focus or not. And then when I had a very helpful and productive board meeting with my two internal chairs, Dawn Slater and Paul Gilroy, they both confirmed to us that they felt that my focus on ignorance was new and was quite a positive direction to take. But Paul pointed out that he had come across some similar ideas in the work of Proctor, looking at, of course, as Proctor became very well known for, looking at the tobacco industry. So Gilroy was able to say to me, there has been some mention of the productivity of ignorance in the work of Proctor, check him out. But Gilroy also sort of gave me positive permission to really believe that this work that I was developing in my own thesis, looking at political theory a little bit more closely, was also worth developing. And in particular, I once gave a presentation on the work of Alexis de Tocqueville. And in particular, Sheldon Wolin, the political theorist Wolin's very interesting book on Tocqueville. And Paul was there during that PhD presentation. And he sort of said, I like how you're interpreting Wolin's work on Tocqueville. Start looking at Tocqueville a little bit more closely. And I think you'll find that you're making some good points there. And so that helpful steer from Paul really complemented my own supervisor, Nicholas Rose's steer to believe that I was saying something interesting in relationship to Michel Foucault, who Nicholas is a world-leading expert upon. They were, so both, this concept of strategic ignorance, I used in my PhD thesis, and it became a thesis that was ultimately titled The Value of Ignorance on Antidepressant Drugs and the Politics of Objectivity in Medicine. So of course, through my interest in objectivity, I was also reading people like Lorraine Daston and really trying to understand a little bit about the philosophy of science, but without being an expert at all in that area. And, later coming to the work of people like Matthias Girel on the philosophy of science and how they, different thinkers in a pragmatist tradition were understanding the effort to govern in absence of firm knowledge about the future, for example. So I really did not have that grounding at all, and I still don't. I'm not a specialist in the philosophy of science, but I was learning from people who were interested in the history of how objective truths come to be seen as plausible in different eras. So this idea of the will to ignorance, and later my a concept that I do think of in ways as my own, because I think I gave strategic ignorance a specific used before sociologically until I gave it that shape. And it was really to talk about ignorance and the strategic exploitation of the unknowns in any scenario, in any policy setting, in any realm, in a way that tried to increase one's own status and authority by calling attention to the uncertainty of a phenomenon. And that was similar to some of the work that was done looking at the commercial usefulness of uncertainty to industries like big pharma and big tobacco. But I think I coined strategic ignorance. I gave it a specific definition that then I've seen cited in many places, sometimes and usually attributed to me. But sometimes even this definition has taken on a life of its own beyond my work, and it doesn't always get attributed to me, but I don't mind. Ideas and concepts come and go. And the term itself, strategic ignorance, there had been a little bit of discussion of it. I don't think the specific phrase was my coinage, but I certainly think the treatment of it, the definition I gave to it, was unique. And that stemmed from me trying to find a way to characterize the work of different social actors, from pharmaceutical regulators to pharmaceutical manufacturers, who were gaining strength, gaining political authority from finding plausible ways not to examine avenues, side effects, clinical trial data that they didn't want to have to acknowledge knowing about. And interestingly, I think my phrase, the will to ignorance, came from an erroneous reading of Nietzsche, interestingly. Because in a passage of his that I use to strategic effect in this first article I published called On the Will to Ignorance and Bureaucracy, Nietzsche actually writes that the will to knowledge is more powerful than the will to ignorance. That's his passage. He takes a conventional approach. I misread him. Somehow I misread him. I'm not sure why, because it was an elementary error. And it was pointed out to me later, I think quite in a nice sort of sense of ironic poetic justice, because me as a PhD student who knows a little about a lot, but not a lot about much, really. I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to correct some of my own ignorance. But it was a productive misreading of Nietzsche that led me to think that he had said the will to ignorance is more powerful than the will to knowledge. And that became my entire argument in this chapter, in this article, in the thesis in general. We cannot assume a hierarchical prioritizing of the will to knowledge as being necessarily more powerful than ignorance. And I said, just look at what Nietzsche says. We have to observe Nietzsche's very good point about the will to ignorance outweighing the status or the value of a will to knowledge. But Nietzsche didn't say that. That was actually my reading of the material. I needed Nietzsche to bulwark my whole argument, but I was actually drawing on the wrong impression of Nietzsche. My own misreading of Nietzsche was useful for me in creating a faith in what I was seeing in this literature and material surrounding my empirical study. But interestingly, when you look back at that passage that I quote in that article, I interpret Nietzsche wrongly, I would say. I interpret him as giving priority to ignorance in a way that I do, but that he actually doesn't do. The only backlash I ever got around my early work on pharmaceutical manufacturers was when my external examiners for my PhD viva, which is that formal ceremony at the end of a doctoral thesis, you have to have it examined by expert external assessors. And they both gave it a very good recommendation. It was a pass without corrections, which in the PhD landscape in the UK is a very positive outcome. But they also said, let's hope she doesn't get sued. She's saying things that will clearly put you and the London School of Economics at legal liability. So you have to be very careful in making sure that these claims are accurate and can be defended, because it is quite politically incendiary, potentially. And I felt confident in the claims. So my supervisor as well placed a lot of trust in me and his other students, and he was willing to feel that he was assured by my own grasp of the material. And what we were saying about the companies, what I was saying about the companies is accurate. What Proctor was saying about the tobacco companies is accurate. So I think rather than coming back at people writing about this agnotology in an offensive way, the companies just ignore us because, you know, that's what they're good at, strategic ignorance. But also it's not useful necessarily to probably from their perspective, create a storm if typically few people are really reading this academic work much at all. So, I mean, in Proctor's case, clearly he's got a much bigger audience for some of his criticisms that he has made. But I think in general, manufacturers often see researchers as insignificant and thus simply ignore us. Yes, in the early 2010s, I was contacted by Matthias Girel. He got in touch with me and said, I've been reading your work and I like it. And I think that we have a lot in common in our approach to ignorance. And we thought that we would put together a panel at one of the conferences, STS conferences. And from this panel, we then decided that we were going to pitch an edited collection. And we decided that there needed to be a handbook on the topic of ignorance that brought together people from a wide range of disciplines in a way that really challenged the narrowness with which different researchers had approached the study of ignorance previously. So, for example, there were a lot of people in the history of science, like Proctor, and others who were looking at the historical treatment of ignorance and its commercial value in different time periods. And they had also developed a very strong interdisciplinary compilation of essays. But I felt strongly that those articles that worked previously left out what I saw to be very important work to be done on the political economy of ignorance. And the political economy of ignorance doesn't simply mean how large corporate actors exercise the exploitation of unknowns for strategic purposes. It also has to do with how the study of the economy in general is shaped by different types of disciplinary ignorance and disciplinary lacunas that are quite useful to the corporate actors. And nobody was really looking sufficiently at the political economy of ignorance from the perspective of the economic study of what we know to be true about wealth creation. And that was one of my major goals, to pull together people who were working in international relations and on economic governance in order to try to steer them to also consider the importance of the economy when it came to what economists don't want to know about how wealth is generated and circulated. In a way, it was something that I wanted to do, but at that time, I almost didn't have the time to do myself because I was working on a very separate project looking at philanthropic organizations. I knew that there were people out there working on the political economy of economics in a way that lent itself well to this project, but needed to be convinced that there was value in contributing to a volume on ignorance, because people actually in ways think it's going to belittle their work if they embrace this notion that ignorance can be powerful and productive. It sort of, in a way, is an effacement of the value of the social sciences to say that after all these decades and centuries of effort, ignorance still haunts us so pervasively. And Matthias, of course, had a very different interest in the project of ignorance, a useful one too, and one that I shared to a sense, but he was really more at the forefront of developing. This is my colleague, Matthias Girel, who was very interested in making sure that positive aspects of ignorance were harnessed and recognized by policymakers. So he was very interested in how a revolutionary distinction that needed to be made, and this is something I also talk about a lot, that we can revolutionize the relationship between knowledge and ignorance by pointing out that ignorance can be a force for positive illumination in different ways. And he particularly wanted to draw on people working in science and technology studies, the philosophy and the sociology of science, who could contribute to the volume. I also had a strong interest in bringing in feminist theorists, as well as theorists of colonialism, and scholars like Charles Mills, who I knew were working on white ignorance in Charles Mills's pioneering essential formulation in a way that I felt was absent from the focus of many science and technology scholars who were interested in ignorance. So Mills was in touch with people like Robert Proctor and others, but there was still a real divorce between the study of colonialism and its ongoing effects in the presence, in the perpetuation of different types of white ignorance. There was a divorce between people looking at ignorance in that context, in the context of what do governing white elites not want to know about the history of colonialism and the wealth drains and the wealth advantages that it conferred on metropoles at the expense of colonized regions. That was an important line of thought that I was familiar with through my interest in the study of global inequality and through my interest in post-colonial theory, but that I saw was not being attended to by scholars in the sociology of science tradition. So we had this quite ambitious goal to really bring together, I'd say, those 4 different strands: political economy of ignorance, post-colonial theory and the study of racialized capitalism and ongoing forms of racial discrimination, positive attitudes to ignorance that could help to revolutionize how policymakers view the need to contend with the unknown, and as a sort of 4th emphasis, feminist theory, which really the insights were and are woven through those other 3 arenas, but not always explicitly so. For a long time, I wasn't sure how I could unite my interest in philanthropy with my prior interest in really more theoretical things like epistemology or anti-epistemology, which is Peter Gallison's nice phrase. I really felt as if I wasn't sure how to conceptualize my critical interest in philanthropic actors. And this, I think, stemmed too from my own ambivalence around, am I an activist or am I a theorist, right? Because when I first started to do my PhD, I mean, I kept a journal at the time. I don't anymore, but I kept a journal at the time. And it sort of said, oh, well, if I get my funding, to do a PhD, I can carry on with some reading and writing, but really fulfill my real interest, which is to politically militate for change when it comes to these gross inequalities that characterize our era. So I saw myself more as an activist. And predominantly, I wanted to be a journalist. And I had worked briefly in journalism before, but it wasn't paying the bills. And I did not find beat reporting, where you tried to write 800 words here or there and pitch it to many newspapers and try to get a freelance commission. I found that too tough emotionally and financially to sustain. But I still felt that it was true that most change in the world was not necessarily created by, the philosophers or the sociologists or the social theorists, but that change was created by people on the front lines trying to raise consciousness. And so that was really where my interest in Bill Gates's philanthropic foundation came from. Because I'll be blunt, I thought he was a fraud. I thought that his role as a leading monopolistic capitalist was completely at odds with his effort to save the world purportedly through giving away a few billions here or there. I don't believe that he is doing some of the things that the extreme conspiracy theorists think that he is doing. But I fully understand and think that there's a logic behind the effort to place on Bill Gates some blame and responsibility for things that feel very disconnected and worrying and scary in different people's lives. So inequality is a problem. And I knew that from an early age when I was confronted with anti-globalization activists through things like protests against the World Trade Organization, which I started to write about. I wasn't at the Seattle protests in 1999, but I was at later mobilizations of so-called anti or alter globalization activists who were concerned about the uncontrollable power of bodies like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to dictate policymaking in newly independent regions throughout Africa and the world. So I was very familiar with some of these debates on economic inequality before I came to write about philanthropy. And so I approached Mr. Gates and his foundation as emblematic of the problems with capitalism that I had been critical of in my earlier activist work. And this was in ways it was an unusual position to reach for someone who was raised in a very privileged family in Toronto. My friends thought I was crazy. My family thought I was crazy. I came from a very capitalist family. The 2008 financial crisis was a decade away. So no one really in the professional circles my family traveled in, they weren't super elite, they were just affluent folks. But in those professional circles, you never had any awareness that capitalism was a system in ways that was compounding different crises and that was leading up to the financial crisis of 2008. And I myself did not think that the banks would come near collapse at that time. But I did think that capitalism was generating much more global precarity than comfortable, affluent people in well-to-do circles in Canada realized. So when I first became interested in activism, it was very much in a sense of being, in ways, both a hypocrite and a bit of a class traitor. But because I don't have an accent that marks me as classed in a particular way in the UK, it's very easy to avoid confronting those sort of childhood dynamics that in some ways made my criticisms of capitalism a little bit contradictory. And later on, 20 years later, all of these same capitalist friends and family now realize there is a major problem because it's affecting the quality of lives of their children and their neighbors. And everybody realizes that there is more precarity across many different economic demographics than people who were protected from that precarity previously wanted to accept. I initially, when 5 years after my book was published, it did seem like quite a few even better selling books on the same topic began to make headlines. And at first I did feel maybe I should revisit my book of 5 years earlier and maybe try to pitch a second edition to tease out some of the points that I felt I had already made. And then I decided, no, that comes from a place of competitiveness. I'm feeling competitive with these other books that are making very similar points. And instead of a feeling of competition, I should feel happy that the spectrum of debate on these topics has begun to cross the political spectrum in new ways and to reach many new audiences in ways that other thinkers and writers and scholars are communicating with, and often with talents and gifts that I don't have, say the talent of communication in a very concise way. I don't particularly like to verbalize my ideas. I don't think I'm as good at it as writing them down. It takes practice, I work on it, but it's not my preferred mode of communication. Someone like Anand Giridharadas has a real genius for this type of communication. He is excellent at it. In his book, Winners Take All, I think made some very good points that were similar to mine about the problems with philanthropic foundations, but that he managed to communicate to different audiences. And I thought, great, let's just embrace all of this discourse on the topic of super rich individuals and their limitations when it comes to true social change, and hope that I played some small role in propelling interest in the topic a few years ago, when really building on many earlier thinkers and writers who were saying similar things, I put that book out. Because my book wasn't entirely new either. People like Naomi Klein had made these points. Vandana Shiva, a very important Indian activist who's made good critical contributions to our knowledge of debates over genetically modified technologies, for example. So my work on philanthropy came out of a long stream of feminist, social justice, socialist work that was pointing out the limitations of capitalist actors trying to clean up the same messes they have created, and then to, be invited to a fundraiser on the back of it where they're feted by different audiences and seen as superheroes. Now I think we realize just how empty that sort of propaganda mission on their part is. And whether it leads, I hope, to a positive change when it comes to funding landscapes in general, that I can only hope does result. So when you say to me, how can we take the lessons from what we've learned about the Gates Foundation and how destructive and problematic their short-termism is, their penchant from just taking money away from a funding stream if it doesn't show immediate results and throwing it at some other researchers, I hope that we can take from that some recognition of the fact that that is not good science, and we cannot let the domains of science be shaped by very rich people who made their money in isolated ways that does not have broader application, often outside the places where they made their money, and also where we have to recognize that it's not just an either or thing. How they make their money threatens science as well, because it threatens the impartial search for truth in a way that is divorced from the commercial effort to keep secret things that don't reflect a scientific corporation in a good light. So my book, The Unknowers, How Strategic Ignorance Rules the World, it tried to do two main new things. I wanted to develop some more concepts and language for talking about the study of ignorance and the uses of ignorance beyond just strategic ignorance. So in a way, I had to keep it in the title to make it saleable and popular to audiences who find strategic ignorance a useful term. But I myself was bored of the concept of strategic ignorance by that point. And I found the very concept really antithetical to my interests in looking at the ways that often there is no strategic element to ignorance. It has just an element of accidental usefulness for different groups. So it's a sort of uncultivated power of the unknown to furnish different advantages on different groups who might not have purposefully constructed an unknown to begin with, but who still benefit from it. A good example would be very rich people who benefit from the fact that theories of wealth accumulation in the 20th century post-marginal productivity theory of value turn, that's a very complex phrase that maybe not all viewers will be familiar with, but to put it bluntly, in the 20th century, a preoccupation with unearned wealth and different types of rentier advantages were really elided from the study of mainstream economics by this so-called marginal turn that emerged at the end of the 19th century as a result of the influence of a few different powerful economists. And so because economists stopped looking at unfair wealth accumulation, it made it seem as if the fortunes of people like Bill Gates were far more cleansed of moral disrepute, then I felt they had a right to be perceived. So Bill Gates is not responsible for the discipline of economics and how economists themselves study wealth distribution. But Bill Gates is still advantaged by a very narrow understanding of the propriety of excessive wealth in different areas. So he is just how much his wealth is truly earned in a neoclassical. So the question of just how much Gates's wealth is earned or not disappears in a sense, and that absence of attention confers a useful unknown on him. So in the book, I developed this concept of useful unknowns as a counterpart to the more narrow and unproductive strategic ignorance. To introduce this typology that I develop in my book, The Unknowers, on the strongs, the smarts, and the greats, I would have to stand back and give you a fair bit of background about how I was reading different political theorists who were trying to make a claim for the potential normative and moral value of restricting democracy in some ways. So an explicit attack on democracy that was being made by political theorists like Jason Brennan, who's based at Georgetown in the United States. And what Brennan does is he develops a notion of what he and others call epistocracy, and they juxtapose what they call epistocracy against democracy as a effective system of rule. And epistocracy can be defined very simply as rule by the knowers. Okay, that's how they claim it is defined, and that is how it's defined. You look at the epi, and then with the epistocracy, it's just rule by knowers versus rule by demos. Now, this is, I think, a hugely problematic attitude to understanding how decisions should be made about how a polity should be governed. Because first, it necessitates you to look at who are the knowers in any society. And why do you assume that the knowers are composed of an elite class of experts who Brennan and others suggest should be charged with the responsibility to govern based on their political knowledge of different phenomena? And they tend to define political knowledge as being really rooted in the capacity to understand prior political decisions, different electoral outcomes. It's almost like seeing expertise as being defined as knowledge of different trivia, in the sense of being able to name facts easily when it comes to what was the outcome of some particular election in a region in a particular place. And if a member of the electorate doesn't have that knowledge, then in essence, they are upheld as having too much voter ignorance. And there's a claim made by Brennan and others that the display of too much voter ignorance on the part of a citizen should be seen as discrediting that ability of that voter to participate in the political process actively. So what I tried to do by drawing on many Enlightenment thinkers from Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill is to say, first of all, people like Brennan are deliberately misreading these thinkers. Because, Mill is seen as someone who might have defended epistocracy because he wants to limit voting privileges to certain educational criteria being a baseline for voting. But that was done at a time when the voting privileges were much more restricted than that. So Mill was actually a progressive in his day, calling for more voting rights for people who were actually left out of the franchise at a time when voting was linked to gender, to race in the United States, and to property ownership. So to actually suggest that John Stuart Mill would have been an epistocrat in today's day is a really problematic anachronistic reading of his work. And I wanted to show how by drawing on the work of Mill and people like Smith. I also wanted to show that what is key to Enlightenment visions of knowledge is that knowledge is in fact perspectival. Knowledge is always partial. Knowledge is never absolute. Knowledge is rooted in human beings in contestation of the idea of some free-floating sort of divine authority or sense of omniscience. So Enlightenment thought was not about really claiming all-knowing capacity to determine decisions effectively and to root that all-knowing capacity in a human population. It was trying to contest divine understandings of authority that claimed a sort of false all-knowing omniscience, not necessarily stating conclusively that that's not possible, because they would have conceded perhaps in the religious sphere, perhaps such a thing might exist as an all-knowing deity, but we don't have access to that deity's thinking process. So no human does. So you need to have checks and balances on the act of governing in order to ensure that no one actually is allowed to mistakenly presume that their knowledge base is somehow unobjectionably more authoritative or conclusive than someone else. So in the book, I'm really trying to contest the idea that there's anything enlightened about epistocracy, in the sense of certainly there's nothing epistemologically enlightened about it, in that it does not further the true message of the Enlightenment, which is that knowledge is always partial and socially situated. And because knowledge is always socially situated and partial, you have to look at which groups can really be said to be more ignorant or knowledgeable than others. Because I show that elite groups in many social scenarios have a strategic ignorance in knowing as little as possible about how their power and their wealth and their advantages undermines other groups. So they don't want to know. And often it's, it's not my point to say, it's a longstanding point in feminist theory and theories of the subaltern and theories of double consciousness. Often it's the disempowered group who knows more. They know how the elites really act, and they know how that action affects them. So they have this enhanced knowledge in many different ways that really make it clear that in many cases, you need to reverse the directionality of who is most ignorant in society by realizing that often it's the poor and the so-called uneducated who have more knowledge about how the world really functions. So that was my first point in trying to criticize the epistocrats like Brennan. And to make that point clear, I developed a typology. And I call them the strongs, the smarts, and the greats. And I say that to understand the ways that it's powerful to strategically harness a claim of all-knowing effectiveness, you need to look at how groups do it selectively to reach particular goals. So my point is sort of twofold. The first is that omniscience is never possible. What's better than omniscience from a governance perspective, if you're in power and want to defend your authority? If you're not going to concede omniscience, or if you're not going to be able to harness that appearance of omniscience, which most people can't, you want to be seen as the most known, okay? So you're always trying to claim others are more ignorant for various reasons. But I say that different groups do it in different ways. The smarts tend to be people like Pinker and others, and like Jason Brennan, who think that enhanced disciplinary knowledge in some sort of arena empowers them to have more say over decision-making efforts than another group. So the smarts tend to defer to the almost omniscient power of so-called science to guide decision-making. Whereas the strongs tend to be populist authoritarians who actually try to imply their closeness and their special relationship to an all-knowing deity. So it's why you see people like Donald Trump, who never really tries to claim he knows everything. If anything, who makes a bit of an aggrandizement of his own ignorance in ways, but he doesn't need to know because he seems to sort of imply this special connection to God that certainly managed to enhance his image with, say, evangelist Christians in the United States. So the strongs try to sort of purport or to claim that they have connections to some unknown authorities that are influential in helping them to make better decisions than an ignorant demos. The smarts try to claim that they have connections to different scientific experts who can help them to make better decisions than the ignorant demos. And in ways, the smarts position might be a little bit more salient or seductive or persuasive to people who live in the center of a space, who call themselves moderates, who think that science is good, and I am one of them. I think science is good, but science is never good if it's bounded by some inaccessible group that tries to claim that they have always more expertise than other groups, like people like the libertarian economists who Brennan associates himself with. So the grades, my third facet in this threefold trilogy approach, this threefold typology, are people who can pierce the false claims of all-knowing authority that the strongs and the smarts try to propagate. So in a recent paper developed with my co-author, Jana Besovic, we try to develop a few new concepts in order to describe how the UK British government, led by Boris Johnson, have effectively what we describe as serfed ignorance in order to maintain authority in the face of widespread knowledge of many errors made on their part, potentially purposefully so, we argue, in order to deflect responsibility for their own failure to take decisions that were scientifically felt to be appropriate at different stages. So for example, they could have locked down earlier than they did. And I don't think lockdowns are always the solution to something like a pandemic. I think they also bring in increased risks surrounding a rise in authoritarian restrictions that might be become more of the norm than the exception. That is worrying, and that is something that needed to be looked at. But the reason why the government didn't lock down early was clearly a populist decision made in order to appeal to different commercial constituencies who were very worried about the economic effects of closing down early and putting limits on different people's ability to work in different sectors. So what we say is that the government in that situation deployed something that we call fatalistic liberalism. And we describe this concept as the compounding of the appearance of the inability to act differently by purposely pointing out how much was unknown about the COVID-19 pandemic in different stages in order to really impress on others their sort of impotency and inability to have acted differently by harnessing the fatalism that surrounded the virus and the fact that its dispersion, its distribution, they claimed couldn't be well known and sort of charted, and therefore they couldn't have acted differently. But in ways they did have information that could have compelled them to act in a more positive way that could have saved many, many lives, but rather they strategically made decisions that signaled their capacity to serve different audiences like commercial groups who were essentially given a lot of time to position themselves as key contractors in different testing and tracing systems. So it gave them time to meet with groups like Deloitte. It gave them time for UK-based private firms to set up their own testing diagnostics, even though a testing diagnostic tool was made available at an earlier time by the World Health Organization. So Jana Besovic and I are trying to develop a notion of fatalistic liberalism in order to really characterize this type of governance through claimed incompetence that we can see in so many areas today.